for women today and yesterday. It being April, we're going to have some birthdays of famous women from April. And we're going to begin with someone who's brand new. She is in my new book. I have a book which is brand new called Women Changing the World. And my regular book ends in the 1990s, so now I can talk about some brand new women, and the first one is Rachel Maddow. You may have seen her. You may see her every night, weekdays, on MSNBC at 9 o'clock. I often watch Rachel Maddow, who is a TV personality, obviously, from our own day. And her birthday happens to be April 1st. So she's a very good person to begin with in talking about modern women, and someone who is very good to watch. That is, if your politics are generally liberal, I think that you'll like to listen to Rachel Maddow. But of course, we have a lot of other April birthdays, and the next one I want to mention is April 3rd, which is the birth date of Jane Goodall, who was born in London, England, in 1934. Jane Goodall is best known, I'm sure, for her concern with the wildlife of Africa, particularly in Kenya, where she worked with the anthropologist Louis Leakey, and she particularly was interested in the primates, the big, especially the big ones, you know, like gorillas and so on, and chimpanzees. The chimpanzees in particular, which are probably the primates closest to us because biologically human beings are considered primates, you know. Now on April 4th, we have the birth date of Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix, who was famous in the 19th century for speaking up for the welfare of people with mental illness. She discovered when she was born in 1802, and she discovered in her 30s on a visit to a mental hospital and a jail, was basically the jail that she was visiting, that she discovered that the insane were being put in jails, you know, and just locked up and chained and so on in order to control their behavior. So she was a pioneer in the establishment of mental hospitals for people with mental health problems. And Dorothea Dix is still remembered today, of course, for her foundational work with mental hospitals. Here in Athens, we have the Ridges building, which was a mental health facility. They began building it in the late 1860s, and by the 1870s, it was taking care of people with mental illnesses, and was used for that purpose until the 1970s and 80s. Now, of course, the Ridges, as it's called today, hosts a wonderful museum. And you should go up there if you haven't been there and see what their latest exhibits are now. Now let's see, who else should we mention? How about my favorite actress from when I was a little girl? I was one of those, kind of precocious types. My favorite actress was Bette Davis. And she came on with pictures. Well, Now Voyager was one of the best known pictures that she made, but they were sentimental, and they were very good pictures, and she was a wonderful actress who won awards, of course, for her acting career. Bette Davis, born on April 4th in, whoops, wrong one here. Born on 1908, yeah, on April 5th. How about that? I was talking more about Dorothea Dix when I said April 4th. But Bette Davis is April 5th. And then there is a woman of whom we don't have a picture named Rose Schneiderman, and you might not have heard of her before. But she was born in 1882 on April 5th, and she was an immigrant, a first-generation American coming over from Eastern Europe. And she was a labor leader. She helped to organize women workers during her lifetime. And so she is still remembered today for fighting against the system which valued property above worker safety. You know, there was a terrible fire in 1911 which killed about 60 women. It was on the top floor of a building that was like the sixth floor. Some of the women decided they would rather die on the pavement and jumped out windows rather than being burned alive. Schneiderman is best known for working for women's safety. Now, April 8th is the birthday for Mary Pickford, who was a famous actress of the silent screen era. She was actually a Canadian, and she was she transitioned, of course, to the talkies in the which started in 1928, but she was best known probably for the pictures that she made in the silent screen era. Now, my book is sort of confused here, and number 7, April 7th, is actually on the previous page, and I want you to see a picture of a good-looking woman named Billie Holliday. She was born in poverty. She worked as a maid. She worked in a Harlem nightclub. She was a famous singer in the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And she was someone who, of course, she made a lot of money as a singer for quite a while. And this is, of course, a glamorous picture of her. She was a black woman. Unfortunately, she turned to drugs and she died in poverty. But Billie Holliday made some marvelous records in the 1930s and 40s, even into the 50s. Our next picture is for April 10th, which is the birthday of Clare Boothe Luce, born Clare Boothe. And she was a well-known personage, especially in the Republican Party. She was a woman who wrote. She was a well-known writer, and she wrote for Vogue and became the managing editor of Vanity Fair magazine in the 1930s. Now, the last name, Luce, is that of her second husband, Henry Luce, who was the millionaire publisher of both Time and Fortune magazines, which of course are, Time is still a very well-known news magazine, and Fortune dealt mostly with business matters. But Clare Boothe Luce, in addition to her own writing and working with her husband on his projects, also tried her hand at politics. In the 1940s, she was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and she was there for several terms. She even gave the keynote address at the Republican Party's National Convention in 1944. Then later she was named by Republican presidents as an ambassador. She became the ambassador to Italy, and that was unusual. She was certainly the first woman ambassador to serve in Italy, and one of the few women and first women ambassadors in U.S. history, Clare Boothe Luce. Now, here's a very different woman called Juana la Loca. Juana la Loca, okay. They're saying she's Juana the Crazy. She died in 1555. And so that was on April 12th, 1555, when she was 75 years old. She was the daughter of the famous monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, who sent Columbus on his voyage, supposedly to the East Indies, but surprise, surprise, he discovered that there was land between Spain, where he sailed from, and the East Indies, not to mention the whole Pacific Ocean. There were the two continents of North America and South America. So they were the ones who set Columbus on his way, but Juana la Loca she was their heir, and she became Queen of Spain, but she had a tough time keeping on it. She married a prince called Philip, but he was not too keen to live in Spain. He was a Frenchman himself in terms of his background, and so she put up quite a fuss when he wouldn't stay with her, and ran off from Spain and so forth, and she put up such a fuss that people decided she was actually crazy. And her husband and her parents saw that she was locked up, and whether she just, she managed to live for quite a while. She died at age 75, and that was certainly long after she had been married to the Prince Philip. But she lived in Italy for quite a long time there too, and like the people that Dorothea Dix helped, because she was considered insane. She was basically locked up in a cell with bars and that sort of thing in one of the castles in Spain. So she lived, it says, for 46 years. In other words, since her late 20s, I guess. She lived in this madhouse, so to speak, her own personal madhouse. Well, let's see. The next person that we have, quite different of course, this the picture shows Anne Sullivan and her most famous pupil, Helen Keller. Helen is the young woman, teenager probably, in the white, well, they're both wearing white, I think, but the white dress, the younger lady with her hair in long curls. Helen Keller was a very remarkable person. I can remember she was still alive when I was a young girl, and so I remember hearing about her. She was deaf, dumb, and blind. And the reason being that as a small child, just really a toddler, she had a serious illness which had turned her both blind and deaf. And then because she really had this illness before she knew how to talk, she was dumb as well. Dumb, D-U-M-B, not being sort of, stupid, which is what we think of it now as being, well, that's a dumb thing to say, a really stupid thing to say. But it's actually the medical term for not being able to speak. So she was deaf, blind, and she grew up, or she was growing into childhood as absolutely, well, she couldn't really communicate with people, okay? So she just sort of ran around and yelled and screamed and that sort of thing, and her parents didn't know what they could do with her. They finally hired a woman from the Perkins Institute, which dealt with people who had problems like hers, and her teacher was Annie Sullivan, who was born in Massachusetts in 1866. And she became Helen Keller's teacher. There's a famous incident telling how Helen finally learned to communicate through the way that her teacher led her into experiences, putting her hand by a pump, pumping water, and spelling in her hand that was not under the water, spelling the word water. And she associated the word water with what was happening on her hand, the water. And she was a very bright child. So she learned, that everything had a name. So she immediately ran around and, put her hand on a tree and held out her hand to have the teacher spell the name in her hand. And that way she learned eventually to communicate. Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan, her famous teacher. Well, let's see, who else do we have here? Paulie Adler. This is a different sort of woman, indeed. She wrote an autobiography called A House is Not a Home. She was a famous madam, that is to say, she ran a brothel, and that was in New York, I believe. So she was often in trouble with the law, obviously, but her customers kept coming back, and she had this well-known brothel in New York until into the 1940s. Paulie Adler. Our next picture is of Isak Dinesen. That was her writing name. Her given name was Karen Dennison, and she was born in Denmark in 1885 on April 17th. She wrote well-known stories in the 19 teens and 20s and so on. And she also went to Africa. She went to Africa with her husband, and then she had a famous affair with a man called Dennis Finchhatton. Now, he was an Englishman, and they met in 1919 and had a well-known relationship. She wrote a book called Out of Africa, and another one that's also called Shadows on the Grass. It says she came close to winning a Nobel Prize. She didn't win it, which is probably too bad, but she was certainly well known for her love of Africa and writing about Africa as well as her homeland of Denmark. Now, for April 18th, we have a woman from long ago history, and it's interesting that our author, Kirsten Olson of Remember the Ladies, this book about birthdays of women, doesn't really, well, let me put it this way, she doesn't really damn this woman, but she's famous in history for supposedly being an assassin, really. Not that she was ever tried or anything like that for poisoning people, but it was said that she did this. And that is Lucretia Borgia. Lucretia Borgia was born in Rome in 1480, and she was the illegitimate child of a cardinal, Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia, and she was used in a way which it was pretty common back in those days. That is to say, being sure that daughters, if people were rich or noble or whatever, they might make advantageous marriages. Their fathers would make sure that they married some man who would help him get ahead, that is to say, the father. And that was true of Lucretia Borgia as well. Apparently, the father, who was Pope Alexander VI eventually, he was made Pope Alexander VI in 1492, a famous date in American history. We were talking about Columbus just a little bit ago, so this was a contemporary. Lucretia Borgia was a contemporary of Columbus and of Juana la Loca. So here was Lucretia Borgia, and married off to, first of all, to, it says, a gentle, intelligent, honest, and extraordinarily handsome man, which would have been good luck for her, I guess, yeah. But actually, he didn't live too long. Now, it doesn't say that she poisoned him, but, and in fact, when she became a young widow, her father, Pope Alexander VI, made an alliance with the French, and there was But I guess they figured, hey, two marriages aren't enough, two advantageous marriages aren't enough, so someone who wanted to see her get married again advantageously killed her second husband. And so you can see why she might have become rather infamous, whether she did any poisoning herself or not. Now they say that she hired poets, and these poets said, "Oh, Lucretia Borgia, a virtuous, beautiful, blonde woman, and very wise." Well, maybe that was just good gossip about her in the place of the bad gossip about her. So it seems there were actually two Lucretia Borgias, one that was the product of her father's political machinations in her marriages, and the one who patronized the arts and the poets and so forth. She died in childbirth in 1519, and she was at that time pretty late to be having any babies, because she would have been almost 40 years old at the time. But that was the end of Lucretia Borgia. Now let's see. Now the 19th of April is the birth date. Well, they're not sure really. Let's see, do they say they were really sure? It says she was born about 450 A.D. And Saint Bridget has lots of legends about her. And they say that her life is not too well known, but she became a saint. So obviously that although they're not sure whether she was born in 450, they do celebrate her birth date at April 19th. And she was born in Ireland. So St. Bridget is particularly associated with the Irish. And there are lots of legends about her, you know. One of the interesting things that was said that she did was when she asked for some land from a wealthy landowner, the landowner said she could have as much land as she could cover with her shawl. And supposedly a miracle occurred. Another thing that I've heard said is that she unraveled the shawl, and, you know, after all the yarn was out, she was able to cover, at least enclose, with the yarn of the shawl, quite a sizable piece of land that she could build a convent on, St. Bridget. And they also know that she died in 525, which would have made her 75 years old. And there's a legend that she was seen for years after her death. You know, it was an image. People would claim that they had seen St. Bridget tending a holy fire like she did in her lifetime. And that was one of the miracles attributed to St. Bridget. Our next woman is Cleopatra. Cleopatra the Seventh, it says here. Now, of course, when you see this picture, you will recognize Elizabeth Taylor, the famous American, born in England, American film star, Elizabeth Taylor, who played the role of Cleopatra in a film about her life, Cleopatra the Sixth of Egypt. It says she was born about 69 BC. But she was born a princess, an Egyptian princess, and so her first husband was actually her brother, because in those days, long, more than 2,000 years ago, the Egyptian custom was to have a brother and sister, prince and princess, marry, and in order to keep the line pure. Well, I kind of wonder about that. They say that there's something like that, first cousin marriages are considered pretty problematic. And as far as marrying your brother, that's definitely out of the possibility in modern times. But Cleopatra VI did marry her brother first, and then when she was still quite a young woman, the famous Julius Caesar conquered the land of Egypt, and she decided she needed to see him and try her wiles on him, and according to tradition, she was wrapped in a rug and carried into Caesar to see Caesar. She got through the CIA people around her and so on by being wrapped in this rug and being deposited in front of Caesar and unwrapped. And she and Caesar struck it off. He was quite an older man by then. He was in his 40s definitely by then, but they struck it off, and she lived with him for about 4 years. She had a child by Caesar, and she went back to Rome and with Caesar, actually, at one point. But Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC. He was famously, killed by other Roman senators because they decided he was taking over too much power. And there's that famous line, when he saw his good friend, Senator Brutus, being in the group who was hitting him with knives and so on. He said, "And you too, Brutus?" And gave up the ghost. Anyway, after his assassination, Cleopatra fell in with Mark Antony, who was another famous Roman soldier, like Caesar. And he had taken over the land of Egypt, and she started a relationship with him. But Caesar's nephew, Octavian, later became Caesar Augustus. He did eventually, they were having a civil war, but Octavian, or Caesar Augustus did win out and killed Mark Antony, and Cleopatra committed suicide, supposedly by holding an asp, a poisonous snake, to her breast. Well, there's Cleopatra, the real Cleopatra, not Elizabeth Taylor. April 21st is the birthday of a famous English author, Charlotte Bronte. How many of you have read her best-known book? It was Jane Eyre, and many, many, many people have read Jane Eyre since it was published back in about the 1830s. In fact, it was published under her pen name. Back in the day, women were considered to be pretty dumb and not very good as possibilities as authors, and so women who today are well known by their birth names were being published in places like England by pseudonyms. So Charlotte Bronte called herself Currer Bell, and when she published Jane Eyre, and it became a marvelous success. and people were astounded to discover that the book had been written by a woman. Charlotte Bronte, you know, had another sister who was quite, well, both her sisters, the ones that lived to grow up, that is to say, two of her sisters were authors, one of them being Emily Bronte, and the other Anne Bronte. But anyway, Charlotte Bronte was born on April 21st in 1816. And Jane Eyre is still widely read today. Now, the 22nd of April is the birthday of a woman who was a French woman known by the name of Madame de Stael. She was born in 1766, and she ran a very famous salon where people would come, literary people would come to meet each other and to meet the public at her salon. And she was born April 22nd in 1766, Madame de Stael. Now here's someone who's quite different. Her name is Hannah Snell, born in Worcester, England in 1723 on the 23rd of April. And she came from a soldiering family. So when her husband, who was a soldier, went off to the wars, she decided to join him by masquerading as a soldier herself. That is to say, she dressed up in men's clothing, cut her hair somewhat shorter, although in those days they were wearing pretty long hair. The men were wearing pretty long hair, since she was born in 1723 on the 23rd of April. And she kept on wearing men's clothing for a while and was not discovered for a long time that she was actually a woman in men's clothing. So she finally gave that up, but she made sure that everyone knew that she had been a soldier for a number of years, and she preferred men's clothing and so on. So she was considered quite different from her time, but that reminds us of Mary Edwards Walker, the American doctor who served in the American Civil War wearing men's clothing. Hannah Snell was of a soldiering family, and she became a soldier herself. Our next woman is Eleanor of Aquitaine. Aquitaine is part of France that's in the south, in the southern part of France, quite some distance from Paris, actually. Bordeaux is the best known city of its era, of its area, I guess I should say. And Eleanor of Aquitaine was the heiress of, she was the only child surviving of a very wealthy man who was the Duke of Aquitaine. And this was sort of before the time of the, as you can tell from the outfit she's wearing there, sort of late medieval, early, definitely not modern times. She was born near Bordeaux in 1122. She's been assigned April the 24th because it says the exact date is unknown. But she was a very powerful woman. because she was this rich heiress. The Duke of Paris, who in those days, Paris was not the capital of France. France was still divided into different territories, one of them being Aquitaine. But she married the Prince of Paris, and so she was, in essence, because Paris was the largest and most famous city in France, she was Queen of France. And she was, so to speak, Queen of France for quite a number of years. She had several daughters, but she didn't produce a male heir. And eventually, her marriage was annulled by the Pope. And she married Henry of Normandy. Now, Normandy was settled as a territory across from England on the English Channel. And Normandy was settled by Norsemen. That's where the name Normandy even came from. But it was territorially a part of France. And she married Henry of Normandy as her second husband. And they had no problem having children. They had maybe 6 or 7 children, and all of them married well. You know, their parents made sure that they got advantageous marriages. And so there were a lot of Eleanor of Aquitaine's sons and daughters who became well-to-do royal personages in Europe in the 12th century. And eventually, the Normans, 1066 and all that, William the Conqueror of Normandy had grabbed England. He had become the king in England. And so this was one of William's descendants was Henry of Normandy in the 12th century, who married Eleanor of Aquitaine. And there was finally a big fight about who should be king in England. One of Eleanor's sons became King of England, and he's famous in history because he was the great crusading Richard the Lionheart. Eleanor of Aquitaine, mother of Richard the Lionheart of England, and he's away off on the Crusades fighting for the Holy Land in the 12th century. She was the regent who ruled in England for a number of years, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, let's see. Here's someone from the 25th of April, and her name is Ruby Doris Smith Robinson. She's a modern woman. She was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1942, and she became a well-known leader in civil rights. She was one of the most prominent women in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. She was a leader in founding the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, often called SNCC, from the SNCC initials of that group. So she was one of the leaders of the lunch counter demonstrations, which I remember from the 1960s, where, in those days, there were segregated restaurants in the South. Blacks couldn't eat at the regular lunch tables or lunch counters. They could go to the back door and give money and get a hamburger or whatever, but they couldn't sit down in the regular dining rooms or lunch counters. So one of the demonstrations that was put on by blacks who wanted to end segregation was to come in, you know, a little group of them, maybe 4 or 5, come in and sit at the counter and not pay any attention when the server said, "You can't eat here. This is a segregated place. This is whites only," and so on. They would sit there until the police came and dragged them off. And that was quite a popular demonstration in the 1960s. So Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, born in 1942, was one of the leaders in the 1960s in the protests against segregation and forbidding blacks from using public facilities. You know, I remember when I first went to Kentucky in the 1950s. That's a long time ago, of course. It's over 60 years ago. When I first went to Kentucky, I saw for the first time the segregated facilities where there were 2 drinking fountains. One said white and one said colored. And that was a very widespread way of so-called public facilities being set up back in the day, back in the 1940s and 50s, and in fact since the Supreme Court had said it was okay if there were separate facilities as long as they were equal. That was a famous decision in 1896, which set up, you know, public schools, black schools and whites-only schools, which lasted until 1964, when the new Supreme Court said, no, separate is not equal. And most places it was definitely true. The white facilities were much better than the facilities for the blacks. So that Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education in 1964 from the Supreme Court ended that segregation. Now, it says that actually she didn't work in civil rights for very long, because she died at only age 27. And some people said someone had poisoned her because she was such an active and leader fighting segregation in the South. Well, April 26th is the birthday of Emma Hamilton. And it says she was quite a notorious woman. They have a beautiful picture of her here in this book, holding a nice little puppy and so forth. But in any case, her most famous conquest was let's see here if it tells. She had different patrons, men patrons over the years, and finally Hamilton married her in 1791, so she became respectable. She became Emma Hamilton. She was born on April 26th in 1765 and was considered very, very notorious in her day. But she did achieve, after her marriage to this Hamilton, she did achieve respectability. And then, in 1793, she met Admiral Horatio Nelson, who was a very big English sailor, obviously, Admiral Nelson, this big sailor. And she moved with him to England. He was a national hero because there was a big war going on in the 1790s and 1800s between France and England. And Nelson was one of the big English heroes. So when she took up with him, or he took up with her, as the case may be, she lived more well-known, but unfortunately, she, after his early death in 1803, she used up all the money within 9 years and died in poverty herself. Well, how about April 27th? Here's someone who is not talked about in my book, Remember the Ladies, but I've discovered that there is a famous modern woman whose birthday is April 27th. Born in 1928, she is the widow of Martin Luther King Jr. Coretta Scott King was born on April 27th, 1928. And of course, she was a big support for her husband during his time as a civil rights leader in the 1960s. But also born on April 27th was a famous English woman born in the 18th century. Her name was Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was born in 1759 on the 27th of April. She was a wonderful writer. Mary Wollstonecraft, this looks like she has naturally curly hair, and she's wearing it with a scarf around it. She was a brilliant radical woman, and she was the author of 2 famous books. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the French Revolution began in 1789, and in fairly short order they got rid of the monarchy, and Napoleon came to power, etc. Well, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a book in 1790 called A Vindication of the Rights of Man, because, like I say, the French Revolution began in 1789, modeled or inspired, you might say, by our American Revolution, which was really a revolution of getting rid of the English and setting up the United States as a separate and independent country. So, that was in 1789 that the French Revolution began, and immediately Mary Wollstonecraft, who was already rather well known for things that she had written, wrote this Vindication of the Rights of Man in 1790. And then when she began considering how women were being treated in the 1790s and for a long time thereafter and so on, she wrote a history of women and a vindication of the rights of woman. That was published in 1792. So she was a well-known radical of her time. She had several children out of wedlock, and that was very unusual in those days, of course, at least among the upper classes, and which she was part of. So she took up with a well-known author of the day, a radical also, a man named William Godwin. They lived in separate houses and so on, but they did get together. And in 1796, she had a baby. In August of 1796, she had a baby and she died in childbirth, Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, interestingly enough, after this little girl grew up, after her baby grew up, she became the wife of a well-known English poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley. Mary Shelley. She was Mary Shelley, and she became the author of a very famous book, which has inspired countless stories and movies to this day. Namely, that story was Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's book, the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, the famous author of the Vindication of the Rights of Man and the Vindication of the Rights of Women. So, who else? It's almost time to end here. I want to mention Catherine of Siena, who became Saint Catherine, and she died in 1380, in the year 1380, on the 29th of April. And finally, Alice B. Toklas. We have a picture here of Alice B. Toklas and her lesbian friend, Gertrude Stein. Alice B. Toklas is a lady in the dark shirt on the right. She was born in San Francisco in 1877 on the 30th and final day of April. So there's our April birthdays. And this is Lois Whaley mentioning my new book about modern women called Women Changing the World, from which I got the idea to talk about Rachel Maddow, born on April 1st and still with us on the TV. This is Lois Whaley for Women Today and Yesterday.